we'll be talking about Python functions. A function is a self-contained block of code that encapsulates a specific task or related group of tasks. What encapsulates means is kind of cover, bring together. Functions avoid having to do things repeatedly. Like you create one function and then use it again and again. We have been using functions before because there are different kinds of functions. Python has built-in functions, and it also has functions that we define by ourselves. So for example, when we need to find the size of a list, we use the len function, which is len. And that we have seen before. We have seen more functions like we've used and methods like append, add, which we won't do so much. But the main issue here when it comes to functions is ability to reuse code. So functions are the most basic level of reusing code in Python. When you're doing something so many times, you want to write a function for it so that you just call that function instead of writing more and more code. Like the example that I gave you, where we have the len method or the len function, because we know that we have to find the length of our containers so many times. The function was built by Python, so it can be reused again and again. So like I mentioned before, we have built-in functions and then user-defined functions. And examples of built-in functions that we have used before, we use enumerate, we use range, we use set, we use dict, input, list, and so many of those that we have seen. An example here, we have a variable called f that has a list of items that you can see. And then we want to find the number of items in that list. And we'll just call the len function, and it will give us the answer, which is 4. So that is how we're using that function. We also have another function which you haven't seen before. This is the any function. This one just takes in an iterable and returns true for items that are kind of truthy. And if it's not true, then it will return false. For example, we have this list. It has false, false, false. If you call the any function on it, the answer will be false. And then this one, it has false, true, and false. If you call the any function on it, it will be true because it's just saying anything here. If anything is true, then the answer is what? True. That's why we call it the any function. An example here is any equals to birds. And then you say, no, this is false. But then this is true. There are quite a number of characteristics of built-in functions, and these are some of the characteristics. Each built-in function performs one specific task. The code is defined outside your code. So you may not even know where the code is, but it's defined somewhere, and it will just perform for you a task. You don't need to know how that code works. Okay? You just need to know that, okay, when I call this method or when I call this function, this is what I get. All you need to know is what arguments the function takes and what values that function is going to return. That's all you need to know for the functions. How the function works, how it is called, what arguments do you need, and what do you receive from the function. Next, for our user-defined functions also have characteristics. You have to specify the task that the function will be performing. That is you, the person who's building the function. You need to specify what task your function is going to be performing. Then you define the code. After defining the code, you need to know how your code works. Then you have to choose what arguments your function will be taking in, if any. Not every function needs arguments. Some functions do not have arguments, but if your function needs arguments, you need to know which arguments, and then you need to choose the values to return, if any. I would encourage every function to have a return statement, but yeah, if there's anything that needs to be returned, you need to know what has to be returned. So when you start building your function, number one, you have to know what your function is doing. You give it a name that is describing what function it will be performing. Then after giving it the name, you come up with the code that will be building that function. That, okay, my function is doing, it's adding. So what steps is it going to go through to add? Okay. And then, do I need any arguments? Yes, if I am adding, then I need to have maybe two numbers to add, or maybe three, or maybe four. So I have those arguments. Then after I'm done with the arguments, and I'm like, what do I want to return? Yes, I want to return a number, which is a total of the items that I have given my function. So I put together all my arguments, add them up, and then return the sum of the arguments. So that was the steps for building my add function. So every function starts with a def statement. And we are going to go to Anaconda, or we'll have to go to collab. And here I'm going to ask one of you guys to share their screen, and then you help me or help us build these things when we start writing the code. Okay? I don't want to be the only one that is participating in this. So my icon is powering up. It's supposed to be in the background, but it's showing here. That's fine. But this is the structure of the function. We have to start with the def keyword and then the name of our function. And then we have a doc string. This right here is a doc string. Here you just write, what your function is going to be doing. And then here you do whatever the stuff you want to do, and then you return the result. You have to ensure that the names that you choose are relevant to the task that is being done. And then don't choose a name that already exists. If there's a built-in function that has that name, then you reserve that name for that function. You have to come up with your own names. And then again, remember, if your function has arguments, always remember the arguments.
And clear. And clear.
Yes.
I'm asking, when do you use the dog screen? String, sorry.
You have to always have the doc string. If the function is big enough, you need to have a doc string, like kind of always. So when we're building code, when we're writing stuff, did I lose something? I may have lost presentation. Was it here? No. When we're working with Anaconda or whatever, we choose to, let me get a notepad. The doc strings usually show up with the help menu. So it will be showing you information about this particular function. For example, if I'm trying to print, and then we'll get this information coming in. Or maybe this may not even work very well. Let me create a variable like name. And then I'll give it names, or explain it better here.
No quotes on the last word.
Thank you. So that is a doc string. So when I write name and I press my tab key on my keyboard, it will show me the doc string, which is trying to tell you details. This one doesn't have a doc string, but if we had something that has a doc string, it will be here and it will be just explaining that A, B, C, D, this does this and this and this and this. So let me get another function like maybe there. Ooh, sorry. But anyway, a doc string is just an example of what the function does and its expectation. For example, if it's an add method, it will have an example like when you do A plus B, it equals to 5. So showing you what you need to put in and what the result would be. Kind of like an explanation of what your application is doing or what your function is doing.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, it does now. It's more of like an explanation of what the function does.
yeah. So you can say my function takes in a number and then takes in two numbers and then returns the summation. Okay? So let's write one function and see. So I want us to write a function that adds to number. And I'll call it add to nums. And I'll say my function takes in two numbers. So we'll give them variables. Just say num1 and num2. Yeah, those are the arguments for my function. And then here, I can write my doc string. It's supposed to be 3 dots.
And Kaya,
Yes,
those are quotes, eh?
supposed to be 3 dots. They're not quotes. They are, what do they call them? Hyphens?
Yeah, I think.
They're supposed to be quotes, sorry.
Okay.
But you know, in Python,
Why do they use like three? Because I was doing some of my homework and I encountered it, but
yeah, they're supposed to be three.
mhm.
But you know, because and returns. They're supposed to be three, but you know when you're writing, when you try to get quotes in Python, like it gives you two because it is assuming that you need two.
Mhm.
Mm. So here is how you describe it. So you can do better than this. This function takes in two numbers and then returns the result. So here we'll just say return num1 plus num2. And then that's our function definition. But we want to use our function. So to use our function, we just have to call it. And what I just did here is I typed add and then tab, and then the function wrote itself, auto-completed for me. So I'll do this, give it actual values, and then see if it adds for us, and it just added. Okay? So if you remember anything, you know that the function does a task. And what is our task here? Addition. What are our arguments? Num1 and num2. What do we return? The summation. And that is done. Any questions on that?
Auntie,
Mm.
so my arguments can be as many as more than 2.
Oh yeah, there can be many.
Okay.
So there's also another thing that I will teach you where you can say args to mean more than one item, but I think we'll do that later. It might get confusing because I want you guys to, for right now, to be defining the arguments that you want explicitly without just saying args to mean any. There's a
Okay.
way you can just put a star and args, and then that means it can be more than one. Like you haven't explicitly defined how many arguments you need. So instead of doing like num1, num2, you could just say star args, and then that means you have many arguments. But we'll get to that later. I want you, as you learn these functions, to be using. I think we have someone coming in. I want you, as you work on these functions, to be explicitly defining what arguments you want for now.
Okay.
Okay. But the arguments
Okay.
can be many. You can have so many arguments, and then you can even have keyword arguments where you say, okay, if there's no, you can say num3 equals to 5, which means this is defined. If there's no num3, then that means that they will use, even if you don't give it the number, it will just take whatever you gave it at the beginning. So let's try that. And let's say plus 7. We have 40. Oh, okay. Let's not give it 7. We don't give it any values. So we have 12 because we have 5 here already. Num3 already has a value. So if we don't give it a value, then it will just take up the value of 5. If we give it a value, maybe like 10, it will take on the value of 10. But if we don't give it any value, then it will take on the value of what? What
They
value?
already assigned the value.
Yeah, it will take on the assigned value already. So now we haven't given it a value. So it will just take on 5. Any questions here?
No questions for so far.
Okay. I know we talk about indentation so many times. I hope you still remember. Python uses white space to organize code, so you need to indent as much as you're required to. For example, whenever we have a colon somewhere, you have to indent. Okay? When we're defining this, remember when we worked on the if statements and the for loops, whenever we had this colon, we indented. Okay?
Yes,
Don't
please.
forget the indentation. Did you say something?
No.
Okay. So yeah, I
Oh
suggest to
yes.
emphasize.
Did you, did
Go
you
ahead.
ask me if I sent something?
Did did you ask something? Did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. So again, since talking about doc strings, if you have a complicated function, you really need to describe what the function is doing. So yeah, these are just examples of functions. We've already looked at one function. So we'll look at more later. But then user-defined functions with arguments. There's this add num, which we just looked at. And then we also have these user-defined functions that do not have any arguments. Do you want us to go through one of them? For example, we can define a function that just greets people. We just say define greetings. And it doesn't take in any arguments, but it returns. We're going to use some methods that we have done before. I would say name equals to, and then we use the input method. Does anybody remember the input method?
Yes, it's used to capture data from the user.
Yes, that is terrific. Exactly. It is just to get data from the user. So we have a function called greetings. It doesn't take in anything, but then it gets data from the user. So it will ask the user, what is your name? And then it's going to greet the user. And then our return will be, let's say we'll have an F string. Do you remember what an F string is?
It's used for formatting.
Yes, it is used for formatting. So we use our F string to say hello to our user. And you say hello, whatever the name of that person is that they gave us, we say hello, that person. Welcome to Python. So this is our define function. It does not take in any arguments. And then we are going to call it here. So we'll just call greetings without giving it any functions, any arguments. And then you see our function is asking us, what is your name? And then I'll give it my name. I'll say, oh, my name is Kim. And then what is it going to return? Who can guess what it's going to print out?
It's going to print out, hello Kim, welcome to Python.
Yes. So it says, hello, Kim, welcome to Python. So that is our function. It doesn't take in any arguments, but then requests information from our users and then greets them. And moving on. And then sometimes we might need to use our function. So we might have to save whatever we're getting from our function. So we can save that in a variable name. An example here is our first function, which is adding two numbers. We might say sum equals to, and then we call the add. I'm using the tab to autocomplete my function, and then we'll be adding 5 and 79. And we don't have to add the third number, it will be added automatically because we defined it that way. So and then after we have put our results into our variable called my sum, we call it my sum. We are going to print my sum. You see that? So we stored the results of our function into a variable called mySum. Okay? And then we printed that variable and it has 89. And so 79 plus 5 is 84. But remember, our function add numbers has 3 arguments, but the third argument does have a constant, so which is 5. So if we do not provide the third argument, we get a 5. Okay? Any questions in regards to that? Anybody has any questions?
No, not really.
Okay. Yeah, so basically that is all for our recap on functions. Functions do have a level of difficulty. Some of them are very basic, others involve using too much, others we just have some if and then statements. We could have some loops in the functions. We could have all levels of difficulty. But one thing you have to know is you need to know what your function is doing. And then also you need to know what it returns. You need to know what arguments, if any, and then how to write your function.